Okay, so we rendered out our environments on Monday. Okay, so now we need to basically add our characters back into that. So specifically, our character and our character's shadow. Okay, so if we combine then those three layers, then we should have more or less everything that we need for our course. It doesn't stop there, obviously, but for our examples, they're pretty straightforward. So it's not that complicated. Okay, so here, as you can see, I've got a very detailed scene, okay, of a monkey on a couch with a shadow on his head in an environment. Okay, so the first thing that I just want to go through again, just as just this specific example, so something very basic to go through just the technique. I have got each of my groups basically in collections. So the character and all of his bits and pieces are in a collection, and all the environment bits and pieces are in a collection. And the reason for that being that with our render layers, the settings generally only save the changes made to collections as a whole and not to individual objects. Okay, so if I had, for instance, we'll get there just now, but if I change the visibility of an object itself and not of a collection, that doesn't save throughout my render layers. Okay, so just be aware of that while we go through this. Okay, so what we have is we already have our background, so we only need to render out another two things, and that is our character and our character shadow. Okay, when you guys open Blender, what often happens is we only have that visible. We only see the little visibility icon. Okay, so for this we need to basically go and make all the others visible as well. Okay, mainly because we need the last two columns as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off renaming my first render layer. So that little block over there is our render layers. You should be able to find it somewhere else as well, but I actually haven't managed to. There used to be a section for it in this tab, which was your passes. But I'm going to rename this to be character. Okay, so what we need for our character is literally, if we look at this image, our environment has already been rendered out. Okay, so we only still need our character itself. Okay, so with that in mind, we need to affect the visibility of our environment. Okay, we can't just turn it off, because then obviously in places where environment obstructs our character or where the shadow is cast on our character, we're going to lose that. Okay, so that's not an option. Turning off the second one also is an option because that disables it completely as well. Okay, turning the renderability of it off does the same in our render as the viewport visibility. So ultimately we're left with these last two options. Now the first one is called a holdout, and what that does is exactly what we actually need. Is it masks out objects in the collection from view layer, which is what that says. So basically, if we turn that on, it will then not render those physical pixels, but still have an effect on my scene. So the shadow on my character is still there, and if I go to the back, it's as if that object is still there. Okay, so if you imagine in your scene where your character is sitting around a table, and your table is already rendered out, we don't want those bits of my character to render as well. Okay, so a holdout basically renders transparent pixels where the other objects were, which means we can then composite that just by layering it on top of our thing. Otherwise, we'd have to render our character and then re-render the table on top of that, and it would be a nightmare. Okay, so just by not rendering the parts of my character that I don't want to see, by turning on or activating the holdout render flag, that's basically all we need to do for our character pass. Okay, as simple as that. So that way we can just render this out and stick it back on top of our environment. Okay.
Does this apply to having a background, the actual background using the two different scenes and then
we're going to get there. Unfortunately, no, but I'm going to show you. Okay. The reason for that is that we don't have these actual controls if we're using a. So, but we just drag it back in. It's not an issue. Okay. Then we need to make our second pass, which is for our shadow. So here, Okay, shadow. Okay, so there you can see now we've got that one, which is our character class, and this one, which is our shadow class. Okay, so as I was saying, the changes we make to whole collections are then saved within this render layer. Okay, so as an example, if I go and turn off the visibility just of my character, okay, the visibility over here, that would also have been turned off. In the previous class, it also turned off in the other scene. Okay, so scratch that. I'll get back to you on that, but go to technology. Okay, so shadow. Now, as I was saying, we now only want our character shadow on top of our environment. Okay, so the first thing is that we don't want to render our character as well. Okay, so either well, we could, but it's unnecessary. Okay, so we could render these as one layer. In fact, we could render the character with its shadow as one thing, but ideally we want as much control in post as possible. So if we have our shadows separately, which we often do in lots of situations, we do want to render just our shadow and just our character. Okay, so if we don't want to see our character as part of this, okay, again, we can't turn it off because then its shadows disappear. We can't do those two because then that has no effect on anything. If we do that, okay, yes, our character goes away and we do just have its shadow on our environment. However, if we were to say, decide we want to go and blur out our character or our shadow or something to that effect, by not having the entire shadow there and actually having a gap here, when we combine them, you can imagine this, if we blur this line, it's going to blur that way as well. So we're going to have a gap in between our shadow and our character, which doesn't help us at all. Okay, so a holdout, not great. But the second one, which is indirect only, okay, basically it then says, there it describes it quite nicely, that you only get the secondary rays. Okay, so in 3D, light is cast as a ray. It hits something and then lights up that object. So a primary ray illuminates our object itself. Then that ray of light bounces off and hits the second object. When it hits that second object, those are secondary rays or indirect rays. Okay, and those lead to us getting shadows and reflections and different color casts on those objects and all of that. Okay, so if we say indirect only, we're not rendering the first time the light hits the object, okay, which in effect does that. Okay, so we get all of our secondary rays, which will be our shadows and our reflections. So, for example, if I were to add in just a shiny sphere, you will still see its reflection as well. Okay, so you can still see its reflections and everything. However, the primary rays aren't there. So the first time the light interacts with that object, which is this object itself, those don't get rendered out. Okay, so this helps for our shadows. Okay, however, as we said, we already have our background. So we don't want the background. We literally just want those shadows and transparent pixels for the rest of it. Okay, so what we do in that case, now ideally what we want to do, just as an example, let me show you, is there's a setting in Blender called a shadow catcher, which is basically a material which renders out the shadow. Okay, so it doesn't render out the surface of that object, but only renders out the shadows that it has caught. Okay, so ideally what we want to be able to do is activate the shadow catcher on the partition itself, on the collection. But somehow that is not as simple as what you would think, to the point where I don't know if we can actually do it. Okay, which would be ideal. Okay, so since we can't do that, we go and apply it to each of the objects within our environment. So the easiest way to do that is to go here, select all of my environment objects, which are those three, and then you alt-click on the shadow catcher tab. Okay, and that will, in essence, activate the shadow catcher for each of those objects. Okay, so now if we go and render that again, we only get our shadow. Okay, so only our shadow, only our character, combine that with the render of our environment that we already have, and we're done. Okay, so that is as dumbed down as we can make compositing. Okay, so that gives us the ability to do a lot. Now remember all the bits that we had last on Monday as well. So the cryptomat that we can go and isolate individual materials and objects and assets in our render as well. So if you're rendering out your character and you want to change the color of your shirt afterwards, you can go use cryptomat to go and do that. All of those are still available to us. The main purpose of this exercise is adding our character on top of the still frame environment. Okay, so whether that is our actual environment that we only have one frame of, so we don't have to render out the whole sequence, or if it's a live action scene where we need to go, like you guys are doing in the elective, where we need to add in our characters on top of something else that isn't 3D. Okay, so all of these are pretty useful for that. The one thing that I just want to double check. Yeah, okay, so the thing that's also happened now is our shadow catcher, that tab over there, that is not included in our render layer. So if we go back here and actually enable environment, it's also a shadow catcher over here. Okay, and for that specific reason, I want you guys to do this in a separate scene to what you rendered your environment out from. Okay, so save that as one blend file, and then in another blend file, which is this one, we can go and activate the shadow catcher on that scene so we don't affect the actual render file of our background. Okay. This shadow catcher, you won't believe, is actually something which is very new to Blender. In other software, it's been there forever. It's just a material, so like you have a glossy and a diffuse or whatever, it's just a material that you can apply to any object. It being a material meant that you can also apply it to collections or to partitions or whatever, and that's how we did it then. But in Blender, it's relatively new. I think it only came into Blender about last year sometime, which is weird, but great that it's finally there. Anyway, any questions on that as a technique? Okay, so now we're going to go and do the same thing to the actual scene that we used last week. Let me just save this as okay, so let's go back to okay, so since Monday, the whole world has changed. Which means that some of the stuff that we did there, we need to change a little bit for this, which isn't the end of the world, but it still sucks. Okay. So that was that. That's what we had. Okay, so this is where we were on Monday. Okay. I just want to delete that because that we didn't use. Okay, so we had our render scene, which had our character and our character's car, and then we linked our background in using this nifty background scene thing over there. Okay, which works really well. Okay, for certain things, it's not directly for animation. Not for render. Okay, since you have no control over it once you use it. This works really well for animation scenes, to be honest. So if you are animating and you really want just a clean scene and you don't want to be able to select stuff in the background, that works like a bomb. Okay, so for animation or anything like that, animatics or staging, that's really nifty being able to add that in. Okay. However, since we don't have any control over this background here, it doesn't help us as much as it did last week. Okay, so we have a few options. And that's also why I'm saying we need to do this in a new file. So either we can, if you want to do everything still in one blend file, you can. We just now need to go and make another scene, which is basically a duplicate of this render scene. Okay. Or we can just save a new blend file, which is probably going to be the easiest. Okay, so if we save this as a new blend file, there's only one thing that we actually need to change to make everything work again. So let's save it as character 2. Okay, so this would then be, then I have one blend file for my environment render, which is just a still frame, and then a second blend file for my character render process. Okay, now the only thing that we need to do is get our environment back into this scene. Okay, so there I've deleted it, so it's not here anymore. It is still only existing over there. Okay, so this whole collection is over here, okay, with all its bits and pieces. So all that we really need to do is set that button over there from view layer to scenes and expand all of these, and you'll see over there is our linked collection, which is all of this stuff. Here is our other scene over there, okay, with all of our character and our car collections. All that we need to do is simply drag that one into there. Okay, so that makes it a lot easier, so we don't have to go and relink things or bring them in or whatever. And there we go. Okay, so then we're no longer using this scene, which we can probably delete for the purposes of this render. Goodbye. Now we're stuck over here. Okay, so that's the easiest way to go about doing that. Okay, let's put this back on view layer, so we have all of our buttons back. Let's also get these again. And then, I think that's more or less it. Okay, so now we're going to do the exact same thing that we did just now. There are a few little snags which shouldn't affect you guys for the way that you've set up your scenes, but it's a little bit disappointing. Okay, but I'll get to that just now. So the first layer that we had made was character, and that one's pretty simple. Okay, now, just as an example, I'm just going to add another monkey over here. Okay, monkey over there. And the monkey is inside my environment. Scene, I hope. Okay, cool. Let me just clean all this up. Cool. Okay, so remember, for our character scene, sorry, almost where we need to be. Okay, so here we are. For our character pass, sorry, remember all that we want to do is just render out our character. And for, as I mentioned on Monday, for this example, it's going to be the car and the guy. Okay, because all of that's moving. For our character one, our environment, we only want to add this holdout to. Okay, so if we do that and say render, let's see what happens. Just give it a second. Six seconds maybe. Okay, and that's weird. Okay, now obviously that's not what we want, and that's exactly why I added in a monkey. So the monkey is doing exactly what it's supposed to, but the rest of my environment is still very much there, okay, which is wrong. Okay, now the reason for that is that yes, we turned on the holdout on our environment collection. Okay. However, within that collection, there are multiple other collections which don't follow those rules. They follow their own rules. Okay. The monkey is the only object that is not a collection within this collection. Okay. So the monkey doesn't have its own options, so it's following its collection's options. So that's why it's working on the collection, but not the rest of my scene. So to get it to work on the rest of my scene, if we have other collections, we need to go and tell those collections that we also want holdout to be on those. Okay, so by doing that, I'm going to delete my monkey now because it's going to be in the way. To render that out, that will then actually work. There we go. Fantastic. Okay. So that is great. Okay, so as our character pass goes, that's fine. I did forget now just to turn on, that was the light that we added 2 weeks ago. To light his face up a little bit more, but I'll just remember to turn that on for my actual render. And also I've got my fog on, which actually isn't rendering in my render, but only in the scene. So that we can also just turn off and leave there. Okay, so for the character pass, works like a bomb, nothing really wrong. Okay, so that's fine. So let's go and stop this render and be happy with that. Okay, so exactly the same as what we did just now. The only things you need to remember, if you have more than one collection within your collections, you need to go and apply the render flags to those collections as well. Okay, great. So let's make our second one, which is then for our shadows. Why is it still rendered? This computer is a bit slow. Okay, so we now, I believe, have second layer, which we can call shadow. Okay, and here it's exactly almost kind of slightly the same. Okay, so again, we need to then turn on the indirect on our character, which I'm going to do on all of my partitions, so not just that one. Okay, so not just the global one, but all the collections inside it as well. So that will then render our secondary rays of our object onto our scene. Okay. However, we don't want our scene as well. We just want the shadow. So for all of my environment objects, and this is where it gets slightly blurry, all of those, I need to go and activate my, sorry, just before I do that, let's turn those on, I believe. Okay, there we go, so that's got all of those. Okay, so all of those, one object needs to be an active object, so just shift click one of them if it's not. Okay, so all of those we need to go and add our shadow catcher over there. So it'll take a second to think about it because it's doing quite a bit. Now, so now if you select any one of these, you should see shadow catcher. Where that doesn't work, okay, so ideally now we render everything should be fine. Okay, where that doesn't work is when we have objects whose materials aren't controlled by the scene. Okay, so for instance, all these things, their shadow catcher is on, right? But they are still going to render out as a normal object. Well, did in the previous class. So ideally now it's not going to do that, and everything's going to be fine. And you look like a fool. And the reason for that is that they're linked. So their materials aren't in here, and for some reason it's not an actual geometry, and for some reason that means the shadow catcher doesn't work on it, which it's supposed to, but it doesn't. Okay. So for this specific example, it's not the end of the world. Remember, this is something that you do need to go and adapt and rework out on every shot pretty much. You know, for instance, and why I'm saying that is this scene, you don't see the shadows of the car on the floor of the environment in any case. So it doesn't actually need a shadow catcher. So, you know, but however, in some cases you would need to. And then there will be linked objects in there, and then you do need to figure out why it's not working. Okay. So this recipe doesn't work for every single shot always. You do need to go and recalculate all of this and figure it all out and apply the technique onto your situation. Okay, as everything with you. Okay, now it's thinking forever, which is good, but also bad. Oh, that's gonna help. Why didn't you tell me my pause button was on, huh? Okay, so there you can see it's working spectacularly, except for the fact that these stalls, which are the only objects in the scene which aren't actually there, they're linked from another scene and they're not working. Okay, so for those, we'd have to figure something out. So I don't know exactly what the answer is. Either it is for the purpose of this render, go into its file, turn on the shadow catcher there, save it again, which is a bit of a nuisance to be honest. Or, if to make that a little bit easier, if you had linked objects, to go and link them to a scene within this blend file, which makes it a little bit easier at least. Anyway, this is all great, however my actual character shadow is also not there at all. So let's go and see why that's not working. Otherwise it looks perfect. Come little thingy, work with me. Let's pause that. Okay, so as I was saying, our actual, oh, they're off. I haven't turned them back on since I turned them off. Okay, so that then will work fine, except for the fact that my stalls are part of my class. Okay, so I don't know 100% what the workaround for that is, but I'm sure there has to be one. We'll ask smarter people than me and see what they do. Okay, so there you go. Okay. Now, one weird thing that you can also see that's happening, which I'm not sure what the case is that whenever I turn on my character, it's casting weird shadows in places that you really don't expect shadows to be. So there's something weird going on in this specific scene, but also this specific scene crashes every time I render it out. So who knows what the exact answer is for that. So you'd have to go and see why this object is casting shadows there, of all places. You know, and turning them off one at a time and seeing what they do. You know, animation is 98% bug fixing and like 2% drawing. That's it. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. I'm just going to jump back to my previous little basic example just for the actual rendering out of stuff. Just because it's a little bit easier to render out from there. This is crashed. Okay, anyway, so in the grand scheme, there are little things that we do need to be aware of. So be aware of those if you're not at the moment. Okay, close that. So I'm going to jump back to that basic scene just to go through some of the render options. Just because that one doesn't render. Okay, now with our render layers, okay, what's going to happen is it's going to render both of these as one, well, as two basic passes. Okay, so the same as what we had our passes on Monday. If we then have a format that supports multi or more than one pass, our multi-layers, which we do using that, then it's going to save both of our character and our shadow as a layer in each of these, or in one of these images. Okay, so that's the best way to do this. The only downside to that is that if you want then those render layers as any other file format, you just need to re-export them out of Blender again. But for our purposes, we're comping this in Blender, we're not using After Effects or anything, so it should be fine. Okay, so just to run through that quickly. We have our character and our shadow. Okay, if we have multi-layer rendering enabled, which we do by selecting multi-layer OpenXR format and going over, let's just make this smaller, 10 frames, we may as well just do this properly. This one's set. Okay, so there we have our scene. It's going to render pretty quickly. We're going to make it render pretty quickly. 32 should be fine. Okay, then all we need to do is set the output so it is rendering to there, which is fine. Let's just say multi. So I know that it's my multi-layer image. Doesn't need to be, for this example, full res or full compression or uncompressed. So I think that's it. So now if I go and press Control F12, it should start rendering that out. Okay, sorry, I lied. Okay, back to 3D view. So if I go and press that, it's overriding frames. Damn it. Okay, so now it is rendering out almost there. Now it is rendering out my character and my shadow. Okay, as separate images in the same thing, rendering the frame range that I set. So now I can quickly render that out. Okay, and then we'll be sitting with a bunch of okay, so it's these, so there you can see our images, and we're actually done already. It's running ordered. Okay, so there are my those. Okay, and just quickly want to render out just my background. So I'm just going to make another one. So you don't have to do this because obviously you don't have moving cameras and your backgrounds are already there. So let's just turn off that, shall we? Let me just see what that does. Okay, so then I'm just going to save out my background quickly. Should go equally as fast. Oh, it's running. Sorry, let me just not do this. I don't know what would happen if you rendered out PNGs with multi-layers, if it's going to save them as separate images automatically, or if it's just going to save one. So don't do that. And then you'll quickly just layer these on top of each other and we'll be done with it. Okay, so if you have rendered out, okay, you don't necessarily need to go and comp it in the same file that you had built it. Okay, so you can do a new one. The only benefit of comping in the same file that you had been working in is if you do have like a variable depth of field or a specific focal depth or something, then you can link back to the camera that was in your scene if you need to. But otherwise, you can 100% do this in the new thing. Okay, so let's just go straight to the compositor. So use nodes, and we're not using render layers, we're using image sequences. We're going to bring in input image sequence, and the first one is our character. Okay, so select the first frame. It will see that there are 10 frames. Okay, so if we do that, turn on backdrop, and we only have 10 frames, so let's do that. Okay, so there you'll see our rendered sequence. Okay, there is our character. Okay, that one has our shadow in, so let's bring our background in, which would be that one. So you guys will just have a still for this one, obviously. And then we can stick everything on top of each other. However, we just need to go and switch this or duplicate that one and set one of them to be the shadow. Okay, so over there you have the shadow, there you have the character. Okay, so the easiest way to get your layers on top of each other in Compositing is by using a alpha over node. Okay, so if I, for instance, have that, okay, you can see the original image is there, but what we're seeing over here is whatever this is. Okay, so ideally that means that that is our first layer, that is our second layer, or the top layer. So then I want my shadow on top of my background, and then I'm going to duplicate that, and I want my character on top of there as well. So there we have all of our rendered fancy animation. I'm happy. In between there, we've gone and added in all of our effects and our stuff and our depth and whatever, okay, which is also great. And then to export this, okay, once we're done, we then go add a file output, which is a composite node, okay, and then that is what's going to be actually saved. Okay, so if we don't have any render layer nodes over here, okay, these are image sequences, then this scene, regardless of what's in it, isn't going to render. Okay, so it's starting backwards. It's looking for one of these if our post-processing is on for compositing. Okay, so it's looking for one of these, and then it's only doing what's in here. If there isn't a render layer, it doesn't even get to the scene. Okay, to save this out, then simply we go and say output, save this as an image sequence first. Okay, so we'll say ping sequence, which it is. Great, let's go and set the output to be not there. So say, well, let's just work in that folder, just make a new one. I normally then say final ping sequence or whatever. Pings is fine. Okay, and this is comp underscore. Okay, then simply by saying control 12. Okay, so small glitch, but we'll go and redo it now. This, our images that we exported and our output of our scene isn't the same. Okay, so therefore it's not necessarily just going to work. So we do need to make sure that these settings are the same as my scene settings, my render settings were, and that's the only difference. So let's just export that again. There we have our 10 frames. Okay, and then what we can do is one of two things. I never actually use Blender to do this, but then compile our images and our audio as one movie. Okay, now the easiest way to do that is if we go, I believe, into our sequencer. Okay, and you can see sequencer and preview. Over here, we can then go and say add image or sequence, and we're going to select those pings that we just exported. Okay, which then will give us this. Nope, that's just doing one of them. Why isn't that a sequence? Says it is, which is weird. Let's just do that again. Okay, I think that did it. Yeah, okay, so you need to select all of them over there, and then you bring your sound in as well, which you have somewhere. And then this, okay, to export this instead of our comp, all that we need to do is in post-processing under the output, just say don't do whatever compositing is doing, just to the sequencer, okay? And then we want to save this as an FFmpeg video. Set the encoder to MP4. That's very, very, very important, okay? If you have audio, make sure that your audio is on over there, okay? So AC. And then we can say, okay, I don't ever use Blender to do final things like that. I normally do ping sequences and stuff and then export it using After Effects, but we don't need to use After Effects at all. Okay, so there we have that. Let's go look for our final thing. This will be in there. And we're done. Okay. Any questions? Pretty straightforward. Cool. Well, let's take a 10-minute break.